Welcome to this interview with Rabbi Anson Laytner, author of the text we're reading, Arguing with God, a Jewish Tradition, which is considered a cult classic, according to his biography. He'll be joining me in just a moment. I will be asking him some of the questions you've shared with me. I sent him all the questions that you gave me, so he's had a chance to look at all of them. Uh, I don't think we'll have time to address all of them, but he's been able to read them, and so he'll be able to respond appropriately. Here we are.
Here we are. Nice to meet you in face to face.
Yes, yes. That's one of the gifts of COVID is that people are so familiar with Zoom, and so it's not that strange to meet this way. It would be fun to come up to Seattle sometime, and if you're ever up in or down in Humboldt, please let
Where
me know.
where where is that exactly?
Humboldt is Northern California. It's about 5 hours north driving from San Francisco Bay Area.
Wow.
It's beautiful, yeah, but it's beautiful. So it's only about an hour and a half south of the Oregon border.
Hmm.
It's where the redwoods meet the ocean. I mean, I can see basically the ocean from outside my window, and just spent time in the redwoods with my Yorkies and wife this morning. It's a really hidden gem, a beautiful place.
I have been through that part of the country before. We drove down the coast and through Northern California to Eureka and Wairika and all those places. Um,
Yeah, that's where I am, Eureka.
Beautiful.
I'm,
Okay.
I'm I'm the rector, the Episcopal priest of Eureka, and I actually live in a house that's the rectory, and we actually have guest rooms, so you can stay here with your family, with your wife or whoever.
Okay.
And I'm part of the Humble Interfaith Fellowship, and there's a rabbi here, Rabbi Nomi Steinberg, who who I believe studied with Reb Zalman.
Okay.
Um, so yeah, and she's amazing. She's incredible. So I'm sure she would be thrilled to meet you.
Yeah.
But I gotta say, I'm really excited that I just decided to spontaneously reach out to you and that you responded so graciously. It's a mitzvah that you just decided to offer this time.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So I want to take advantage of it as best I can.
Okay.
Um, I was noticing, I was looking at your biography on your website,
Mhm.
and I mean, because I was trying to figure out, how do I introduce him, but um, I don't know if that's necessary because I could just direct people to this
That's true.
introduction. But I do want to point out that one of the first jobs, I guess the first job you had, was given to you by Rabbi Yitz Greenberg when you lived in New York. Organization called the Center for Learning and Leadership, CLAL.
Mhm.
And I highlight that because the organization that hosts this class is called Center for Anglican Learning and Leadership. So it's very simple. It comes full circle here. You're now
Mhm.
giving a guest lecture for we call it Call, CALL. Um, and you used to were you a teacher for CLAL or
Sort of a jack of all trades. It was my first job out of school, so I taught, I photocopied, I made sure the boss's itinerary was kept to a little bit of everything.
excellent, excellent.
Yeah.
Well, I first came across Arguing with God, which I love how it's referred to as a cult classic now. Um, I came across it several years ago, and I realized this is what like I've been waiting. I was looking for. I was looking for someone to to survey this tradition, especially in the Jewish tradition, because that's where I see it so robustly. Um, and I knew, if I couldn't find it, like, is this something I should do? But it doesn't feel right. I'm not Jewish. I wanted to I wanted to hear from a Jewish person's perspective. So I'm so grateful that you wrote that book, and that it's continued to speak to so many. It's amazing how much you cover in that relatively short book. You do an
Mhm,
amazing
mhm.
survey, and
And you mentioned that you've got Dov Weiss's book, which is fantastic. And yeah, it's thin, but it's only covering like a tiny little sliver of this. So I did the survey course. He's doing the graduate course.
I know. I'm so grateful for you introducing me to that book. I have not read the whole thing yet. I started digging into it, and I thought, wow, this is going in depth in an
This
amazing
is.
way. And then another book that you introduced me to, the original book,
No
Contentions
kidding.
with God.
It's available now.
Yes, it's available. It's amazing. It's clearly, I mean, it's written on a typewriter, and I mean, he's got like scribbles on it, but I mean, it's 39 pages. I read it in one sitting, and it was really incredible. I thought, oh, he's doing even a briefer survey than you.
He was, to my mind, he was the pioneer,
Yeah,
and I kind of picked up from his work. And then people like Dov Weiss are picking up from my work and taking it on a much deeper level. And then other people like Daniel Migliori and Catherine Billman uh,
right.
are taking it into a Christian tradition, and yourself into a Christian tradition. There you go.
Yeah. Well, that's one thing I've enjoyed about teaching this class. I've just been able to delve into all this literature, and even that email you sent me was really helpful. Some of those I had read before, but others I hadn't, and I want to create kind of like an annotated bibliography. This is another good one you
Okay.
introduced
Mm-hmm.
to. And yeah, I want to share that with my students. I think you mentioned this author, Belden Lane.
Mm-mm.
Okay, he wrote this amazing article called Chutzpah Kalape Shemaya,
Okay.
um, and it's covering the tradition of arguing with God in specifically Judaism, but then he also looks at other faith traditions.
What's it?
And it
Tell
was,
me the name. Tell me the name of that book again, please.
well,
Is it in that book?
it's not. This is the author, Belden Lane,
Okay.
and the article is Chutzpah Kalape Shemaya, and I'll send this to you.
Okay.
Um, I'll give you the information. Chutzpah Kalape Shemaya, a Christian response to the Jewish tradition of arguing with God, from the Journal of Ecumenical Studies, 1986.
Wow.
And I wonder if he was engaging with what you wrote, because when did you first publish Arguing with God? Was it in the 70s?
1990.
Oh, 1990. Okay, because I thought I saw that like the hardcover was available. Um,
I think it was 1990. Yeah.
okay, 1990. Okay,
Anyway,
yeah,
yeah, I'll have to see if I can get a hold of that article.
yeah, because he references a little bit in this book, Backpacking with the Saints, about a rabbi who actually is in the hospital and all this crap is happening in his life, and he ends up saying "F you, God." He ends up
Mhm.
yelling at God and cursing out God, and then he has this incredible kind of mystical experience, kind of like what you describe in. Um,
In that book.
oh
Okay.
my gosh, this book is one of my favorite books. It's
Oh,
amazing. I just finished reading it today, and oh, what a journey! What a journey you've been on. Um, Thank you for being so vulnerable in your sharing and
it's
your knowledge.
it's my latest thing. It's like no more academia. It's like if I'm doing theology, it has to start with me as a person and then go outwards. It's no more hypothesizing about God and other things like that. So it starts with me and other human beings and then builds up.
Yes, and you mentioned that. You mentioned an Episcopal priest, Mary Frances, I believe. I don't know that person, who talks about Anglican theology being from the bottom up,
Mhm.
which I think is a very generous way of understanding Anglicanism. When we're at our best, that's what it is.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, really beautiful, and I love how I mean, you're still weaving in. I mean, your brief summary of arguing with God in Mystery of Suffering and Meaning of God is just beautifully condensed and distilled. I'm curious what personally drew you to arguing with God, and what first inspired you to delve so deep into the Jewish tradition and then to write about it?
Okay. I think, as with many Jews, my generation and older and younger, we wrestled with the question of, if God is as our tradition says God is, then how could God have allowed the Holocaust? So there was already that argument in many of us.
Yeah.
And as I guess, a university student, and I started looking at the Torah in more detail, um, I found that certain stories resonated, like Abraham arguing with God about Sodom and Gomorrah, or Moses arguing with God about the fate of Israel. And I said, yeah, this really speaks to me. So that, coupled with the fact that I was in my late adolescence, so I was also interested in rebelling against any father figure that I could find. And God, of course, back then was the ultimate father figure. So the two kind of came together, and I went to rabbinical school, and I found a professor who said, "You want to study this? Okay, go and study, and I'll be your thesis advisor." So from that came the kernel of arguing with God.
Wow. Okay. I love that it's connected with this desire to rebel against a father figure. I think I can relate to that to a degree. And yeah, and the idea that in light of the Holocaust, the reality of the Holocaust, theodicy seems to just fail. I mean, theodicy is there are no theodicies that are adequate.
Right, right. And for me, protest was a way of affirming God and affirming my belief in God's justice, but at the same time saying, I'm really pissed off and angry at the way things are, and I'm letting you know.
Right, right. And that's how it resonates with me. When I've preached on this many times, and there have been some people, not a lot, but some people, usually maybe other priests, who say, "I'm surprised that you still believe in a all-powerful, all-knowing God, omnibenevolent God," which I know you've kind of laid that aside in many
Mm-hmm.
ways right now. But yeah, if you really want to uphold those characteristics of God, protest seems like the only logical response.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I almost wonder if, just following your journey, if like the protest becomes maybe kind of maybe the last stage of holding on to that. I mean, I just wonder if I'm like, am I going in that direction? Because I was really interested in you saying that arguing with God, although it may have kind of led you in a different direction, it ultimately was a spiritual dead end for you.
Mm-hmm.
And you talked about arguing with God as initially your preferred medicine for treating the wounded Jewish soul, wounded by all kinds of
Mm-hmm.
suffering, including the Holocaust. And so one question that I've been inviting the students to ask, and I've been asking, is, where does arguing with God become, where and when does it become too much or not healthy? And I think your image or your metaphor of medicine, I think, is brilliant. It made something click for me. Yes, it is medicine, but you don't overdose on medicine. That will hurt you. But if you
Mm-hmm.
take it in small doses, it will potentially really heal you and transform you. But I'm curious, can you talk more about how arguing with God was a dead end for you?
Sure. I think as a form of prayer, it can be very therapeutic, both emotionally and spiritually, um, because you're articulating what you're feeling. Um, but at some point, you have to move on.
Yeah.
And so I think there are a couple of different ways that one could move on. One could kind of make peace with the traditional ideas of God and return to a prayerful life as we know it, and then punctuate that every once in a while with more protests saying, yes, all this stuff, but I'm still really upset about this.
Yeah.
Or you can, as I did, say, well, maybe all our inherited ideas of God are just that, inherited ideas, and I should be open to experiencing God in other ways, whether those are, well, many different ways that one could experience God, which then made me realize that if my God concept has changed, then I don't necessarily need to protest because I'm not holding God accountable.
Yeah.
One of the beauties of the book of Job is that, unlike most of us, Job had an incredible spiritual experience at the end of his argument.
Yeah.
Most of us argue or protest, and then life goes on the way it does. So in that sense, it's a dead end, unless one has that kind of theophany, like that rabbi that you were talking about in the hospital. Unless one has something like that, I think it is a kind of a dead end.
Right. And yet you did have something like that when you were younger that kept informing you, that gave you the sense that there's a presence there.
Right. And I think that is what made the difference for me, that I always believed from that spiritual experience that there is something that we call God.
Yeah.
And so instead of saying I'm protesting, and instead of saying I'm protesting against God because of the injustice that I see, there is no God, I didn't go that route. I didn't become an atheist. I still believe in God. I just changed my ideas of God.
Yeah, and that I think is so profound, and that's one thing I want to share with my students. The reason why I think this tradition is really important, because my understanding is maybe the number one reason why people leave religion, leave any sense of belief in God, is because of this problem, the problem of suffering. There's no way there can be a God because look at all the suffering. I'm throwing it out.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, maybe before you throw it all out, maybe it's an invitation to have a more mature, sophisticated, nuanced understanding of the divine, like yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And I also wonder, even if we were to let go of a lot of the omnis, the omni benevolence, that'd be a hard one to let go of, but the omnipotence, the omniscience, I think one can still practice arguing with God because, as you experienced and a lot of people experienced, there's a capital P presence that's there and that is probably listening to us and that probably does care about us.
Mm-hmm.
And just knowing that someone's listening to me when I am pouring out my soul and my frustration, my anger, that is healing. At least I've experienced it that way.
That's certainly true. And then there's also, I don't know, like if your students are going into the ministry.
Yeah.
Okay, so then as clergy, there's like an added level to that your community that you're serving may not be at that same theological level that we are at. And so by introducing them to arguing, or by actually arguing, offering prayers of protest, you are kind of shaking them up spiritually and saying all those ideas you learned in Sunday school, well, they're good for kids, but I'm going to shake that up a bit and introduce you to something new and different and see if they grow. And hopefully they would.
Right. Yeah, well, a lot of my students, it's sort of a continuing education program. So a lot of the students already are clergy. Some are deacons, priests, some are lay leaders. And I think that's what drew them to the class, because they've already seen how this can be again, I'm going to use that metaphor of medicine. This can be powerful medicine for people
Mhm.
who are kind of teetering on the verge of like, do I even believe in any of this because this doesn't make sense?
Mhm.
Well, bring those questions directly to God, like Job did, and see
Mhm.
what happens.
Mhm.
Maybe you'll get a kind of theophany like
Well,
Job and others did.
yeah, but I personally have used it with people when they are facing tragedy. So as a um, not a, I guess a technique, but to help them deal with their grief,
Yeah.
you say it's okay. You don't have to say, God did this for a good reason. You say, I'm mad as hell.
I'm not going to take it anymore. Yes, right.
Great, it's okay.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, that's really kind of how I'm trying to frame it. This literature, this tradition is a powerful resource for our own spirituality and for pastoral care.
Mhm, mhm,
And in my experience, in sharing this tradition with a lot of Episcopal churches, um, with people who are have more life experience than me, they're usually a few decades older than me. Maybe they don't have that same kind of adolescent rebellion that hopefully I'm growing out of. But um, I noticed that there are a number of people who just say, I don't have any anger towards God. And I want to say that's fine. Like don't I'm not telling you to be mad at God. Like I don't think that's helpful to be like take this medicine, you have to take it if it's not something that is going to heal you. But I think for some, including myself, it's been really powerful medicine that it's
Yeah,
kept
so
sane.
you take aspirin only if you have a headache, and if you have a spiritual heartache, you take protest.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, uh, and I want to get into some of the other students' questions, but I've been reflecting on this as I've been delving into all this literature. How I mean, there's this, as you probably experienced because I know you've done a lot of teaching. One of the luxuries, in a sense, is I get to just spend a lot of time with this material that I don't always get to spend time with, and I find it so invigorating. I find the stories so perplexing and sometimes hilarious, as you point out, like with Levi Yitzhak of Berdichev, um, and so brazen. And yet, I also wonder if in just immersing myself in this tradition, I wonder if this is similar to. I wonder, is this all of this focus on just this material? Is this actually healthy? Am I spending too much time with this one medicine? Because as you talk about in your second book, or your not your second book, but your latest book, um, there's so much more to life than arguing with God, right? I mean, gratitude is so important. Being present to the moment.
Mhm,
What I tell my congregation is the most frequent command in all of Scripture is praise the Lord, praise God, give thanks.
mhm,
And when I
mhm.
do that, my life changes. I feel more joyful.
Right.
If I'm always shaking my fist at God, I'm not. I don't know if that's really good for me. So I'm wondering if even spending time with this material and writing this book, what was that like for your soul?
You're right. And I think I mentioned that in my Mystery of Suffering book, um, that I kind of built this tower around myself.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and in the end, I realized, hey, I'm stuck in the middle of this tower and I can't get out.
Yeah, yeah,
and and you're absolutely right. I mean, arguing with God is good to a point. It's not meant, it never was meant to be the be all and end all.
yeah,
Um, it's for me, it was a response specifically to what I saw as the fallacy of petitionary prayer.
yeah.
So praising God, I'm fine with. Expressing gratitude, absolutely, I do that a lot. Um, Being thankful for creation, for the gift of life, for the people that are in my life, for nature, all kinds of stuff. All of that works for me. But when it came to petitionary prayer, I said, if God answers petitionary prayer, but somehow managed to ignore the millions of petitionary prayers during the Holocaust, then what sense does it make for me to say, heal my bunion?
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. Right.
Or help me pass this test, or give my football team great strength.
Yeah. Yeah.
It just doesn't make any sense. So
Yeah.
protest was my response to petitionary prayer. And my response now is I don't petition God for anything. I thank God, I praise God, I express wonder, but I don't ask for anything.
Yeah. Yeah. God did not answer my prayers when I was praying for the Niners this last weekend. So I got some protest to do.
But I have one other thing though
Yeah.
about petitionary prayer. One of the things that I've come to realize about petitionary prayer, when you're asking for healing or things like that, is that it's as much a way of telling God what you want, but it's also a way of informing your community
Mm.
of something. Like, at least in the Jewish tradition, we call out the names of people who need healing.
Yeah.
So or people who are mourning, you identify who's mourning. So it's a way of telling the rest of the community what's going on in your life. So there is that communal aspect as well.
Right. Right. And that relates to, it seems like one of your conclusions in your latest book about the presence of God can be experienced in community, in a community that
Mhm.
cares, a community of compassion.
Mhm.
And that segues nicely into this question by one of the students. In light of the atrocities of the 20th century, the world wars and the Shoah, and the challenges we face now regarding prejudice in its various forms, including anti-Semitism that just
Mhm.
came up just in Orlando, racism, homophobia, and the like, not to mention, you know, pandemic that we're facing, the environmental crisis we are facing. How might a tradition of arguing with God once again become significant for the Jewish community, and I would add, and other religious communities? And I think connected with this is, what's a practical way that faith communities can integrate this into their worship services and their religious lives and their liturgies?
Mhm.
Or did you ever experiment with that?
Protest works when you have the expectation of God doing something that God isn't doing.
Yeah.
Um, and all of those things that your students mentioned are caused by human beings. And so you can't, if you believe that God controls all of human behavior, then I guess you could protest to God and say, how could you allow this terrible environmental catastrophe to happen?
Yeah.
But that's really letting people off the hook because we're the ones that created the problem.
Right.
And so I'm trying to articulate, there's like a different quality to protesting to God for things that you believe God is responsible for, but it doesn't make sense to protest to God for things that God is not responsible for.
Yes. Right.
So I don't see it being used that way. The one time that I actually used arguing or protest as opposed to teaching about it was when my sister-in-law died.
Mm-hmm.
And I used it right at her funeral.
Oh, that's right.
And that was the only time I actually did it. And I thought it was very effective. People really thanked me for speaking something that was in their hearts as well.
Yeah.
So I think it would be used sparingly.
Yeah, and the context of that is so appropriate because that was your way. I mean, because you were grieving, you were the one grieving along with others, but you were directly um, hurt by that loss, and so this was your way of telling the community, "This is how I'm grieving.
Mhm.
Now, will you meet me here?" Rather than maybe forcing that onto a community, saying, "Hey," because I've done, sadly I've done more funerals than baptisms or weddings. Um, but yeah, I've never told someone you need to get mad at God. But I certainly want to create space where yes, it's okay.
Mhm,
Grieve in
mhm.
whatever way feels right to you. And yeah, and that would be a powerful way to introduce to my community a healthy way to grieve that's connected to the Christian tradition and especially the Jewish tradition, is to say, this is how I'm grieving. I am shaking my fist at God.
Mhm.
Your point about, yeah, this idea that environmental disasters that we're already facing, so much of it's caused by humanity. That's some of my students brought that same point up. Like this, we need to look at ourselves, and absolutely, that is absolutely true. And yet, I also want to point out just you know, the sense of climate justice or climate injustice. Isn't it the most wealthy? Isn't it the people in the United States or the most wealthy population that produce the most carbon emissions, and
Mhm.
those who face the dire consequences of climate change are producing the least amount, and they're the most vulnerable. Whereas we, who are creating the havoc, have the options to protect ourselves, and we see that to the extreme with. I was just wondering, did you write this, or it was published during?
Right before COVID,
Yeah, and during the presidency of
people
Donald
were
Trump,
walking into, yes.
which I just think, like, that's the perfect example of someone who creates havoc, and
Mhm,
a lot of other people are paying the consequences. He seems to be getting away scot free, and so
mhm,
that it just makes me relate to the psalmists who say, "How long are the wicked going to prosper and the innocent going to be suffering?" And so for
mhm.
me, that yes, it is on us, but yet it's the people who are the least guilty who seem to be getting punished the
Right,
most, and that makes me angry.
right, right. So as a rhetorical question, you can use protest in that sense.
Yeah.
Even if you don't expect God to suddenly airlift Donald Trump out of the White House, you can still say, how long are we going to put up with this? So definitely you can use it as a kind of rhetorical thing. Uh, Otherwise, you could use laments, like kind of not lamenting, expecting God to do things, but lamenting our stupidity, or our greed, or
Yeah.
things like that. So there's the lament tradition and the protest tradition sometimes um, interlock, and
Yeah.
sometimes they're very separate.
Right, right. And we see that in the literature for sure. You write that you would describe your relationship with God as agnostic mysticism. How do you connect the arguing with God tradition to your understanding of Jewish mysticism?
Okay, I'm not a real scholar of Jewish mysticism, and kind of dabble in it a little bit. Um, the agnostic part had to do then with being on the fence about a lot of the ideas about God. Um, and the mystical part had to do with the fact that I had experienced God.
Yeah.
And I developed that in my later book, where I kind of flesh out the ineffability of God, and how I don't want to ascribe anything to God because that lessens that ineffability. Um, so I'm still well, no, I'm less of an agnostic, in terms of traditional ideas now. I've grown more comfortable in that. So, you know, back in the day, there was this thing called the Death of God movement.
Yeah.
I don't think it was really ever talking about death of God. It's more like, to me, it felt like more like death of a God concept.
Yeah, or death of theism, as Spong
Yeah.
said.
So in that sense, I'm part of that. And it's like, God is dead, long live God. It's just,
Long live God, right? Yes,
yeah.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah, well, it's an interesting um, term or a phrase, agnostic mysticism. It made me think of Job, who at the end of his mystical experience, which automatically I would say makes him a mystic, he says, and I know there's a lot of different translations of this, and I love how you began with this in-depth reading of Yov. Um, he says, I let go, and I'm basically okay with not knowing. I'm okay with not
Mhm.
knowing. And that seems like where you've arrived.
Exactly.
You've shaken your fist, and that's gotten to, as far as it can go. But then you have this experience that you remember of the presence. And you say, okay, I'm going to let go and be okay with my finitude and not knowing.
Mhm, mhm. Now, the challenge for me as a Jew is how do I translate that into being in community with other Jews
Yeah,
who
yeah,
still go and worship every Shabbat and do the same old prayers that they've always done. Um, and even more so, if I were leading a congregation,
right.
how then would I translate my personal idiosyncratic Judaism into something applicable to a group of people?
Yeah,
Which
yeah.
makes me glad that I'm old and I won't have time to do that.
I know. Yeah, I could relate to what you were saying. Maybe I forget exactly where it was, but how it's really the poets and the artists who are being able to freely articulate um, honestly what's going on theologically, spiritually within probably all of us, whereas it's the rabbis, and I feel implicated in this as well, because as a priest I'm part of the institution. I got skin in the game of the institution. So for me to just start cussing out God in church is not gonna it's not gonna fly. Even though I could say, hey, I'm backed up by tradition, my congregation will be like, no, that's not okay. That's and my bishop would probably be like, no, that's not okay.
Mhm.
Um, so I feel that tension. Yeah, and yet I want to kind of still offer that offer that medicine. Um,
I guess as with other dangerous subjects, the way to start is by preaching about it, by
yeah,
teaching about it, creating a safe space for it, allowing for divergent points of view in the congregation, and then maybe there's a way to kind of have that gradually move into congregational life and it would be okay.
yeah,
I can't tell you how to do what the bishop though.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
I wanted to say something about arguing with God and other faiths.
yeah.
To me, arguing with God, and I could be wrong, but I really have not seen it expressed very much in any other faith tradition. Um, it's there a little bit in Christianity. One could argue that Jesus on the cross was arguing with God, but if you look at the psalm that he was quoting, it's really more of a statement of faith if he was intending to quote the whole psalm.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, so we don't know, but there's a little bit of it in Christianity that there's almost nothing of it in Islam. Um, it seems like the further away you get from the ancient Jewish sources, the more normatively pious our religions become, including Judaism.
yeah.
So it becomes very unlikely. I can remember an encounter I had with an African American minister here, where we were sitting down for lunch, and I said something about arguing with God. He pounds the table. You can't argue with the Almighty.
Wow. Yeah.
I said, of course I can. Moses did, Abraham did. You can't compare yourself to them. I said, they're just Jews. He did not appreciate it at all. So you have to
Yeah.
be judicious in who you're talking to because they can get very offended by this whole idea.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. So actually, you're absolutely right. When I started my PhD in Christian spirituality at the Graduate Theological Union, a great place to be exposed to other faith traditions. They have a great Center for Jewish Studies. I actually studied with uh, Professor Nomi Seidman, who's now up in Canada. She was fantastic. She seemed to basically see the argument with God tradition as a creative way of basically saying we don't believe in God anymore. Like it's just 'cause it shows the cognitive dissonance so much. Um, but I kept looking for. I mean, I was studying the history of Christian spirituality, looking at the patristics, the medieval theologians, the medieval mystics, for something that was similar to what I see in Judaism. And again, as you point out, it's not dominant in Judaism.
Mhm.
It's marginal, but it certainly stays there. It's persistent. That's why I wrote that article about why does this disappear? Um, and tried to engage with Boyarin's understanding of the logos. Um, the only places I could see it in Christianity, and this is me kind of really stretching the definitions of protest, um, are some of my favorite mystics, female mystics actually. There's this woman, um, Julian of Norwich, who Thomas Merton says was the greatest English theologian. She had these mystical experiences, these visions, a kind of long near-death experience, and God keeps telling her, "All shall be well, all shall be well." I mean, this is the midst of the plague and um, 100 Years' War, and she's just seeing suffering all around her, and she says, "God, why did you create the world this way? You could have prevented sin from entering in the first place."
Mhm.
God says, "Sin is behovely, sin is necessary, but all shall be well." But what I like about what she does is she then comes back and says, "Yeah, but no, that's not good enough." She kind of keeps, she has this kind of feisty chutzpah.
Mhm.
Um, and then another example is Teresa of Avila, who a lot of people think was a converso or came from conversos.
Hmm.
So I think she probably had some Jewish blood in her. There's a story of her um, traveling to maybe, I guess, set up a new monastery, help a new monastery out in Spain, and she falls off her horse into a puddle of mud and cries out to God, "God, if this is how you treat your friends, no wonder you have so few of them." Which sounds kind of Jewish, doesn't it?
It
It doesn't
does.
sound like a Christian saint. Um, Augustine can be a little rough with God, especially, I guess, in asking the questions of suffering. He's very passionate about that question, and he gets emotional about it. Um, some in Dostoevsky, maybe, but
Mhm.
that's in his novels, obviously, because he doesn't write theological treatises. And then probably the most recent, I mean, not the most recent, the one recent before Brueggemann and the kind of revival that we've experienced in Christianity would be C.S. Lewis in
Mhm.
his Grief Observed. He gives it to God. He says, "God,
Hmm.
what are you, a sadist? You're a vivisector?" And I think that might, C.S. Lewis might be kind of the one who helped me see this as an authentic
Hmm.
um, spirituality. And then just the Islam. I have not studied Islam much, and I don't think this is considered. Well, there's that story. Maybe it's in the Hadith of Muhammad going to the night journey. He goes up to heaven, and God says, "My people need to pray to me like 50 times a day." And he comes down, and guess who he sees? He sees Moses, who's the Jew, who says, "Oh, we got to haggle with God a bit there. That's not going to work. Can we talk him down?" And so he kind of does what Abraham does and goes down to, I don't even know, what is it, 5 times a day now?
Yeah.
5 times a day. And so God says, "Okay, yeah, it'll count as 50 times a day, but we'll make it 5 times a day." So that's the one place in, it's not in the Quran, but it's in extra Quranic literature where I see
Mhm.
some of that feistiness. And Belden Lane in his Chutzpah Klape Shemaya article talks about even some in maybe Hinduism and Buddhism, which doesn't, I
Hmm.
don't quite know what it is because they don't really have that same
Yeah.
monotheistic God.
Huh.
But all that to say, excluding those potential um, exceptions, you're right. Like it's not there, and people get angry. Yeah, it feels blasphemous to a lot
Mhm.
of people, and that's why, yeah, I'm grateful for Brueggemann and, yeah, mostly, yeah, Westermann and Brueggemann, who say, "Hey, no, this is, when we study our scriptures, this is okay. In fact, this is valid. God says Job's the one who spoke um, honestly about me.
Hmm.
So since then, yeah, Christians I think have been drawn to this kind of boldness in prayer. One example is this is what the students read when I asked them to write a question for you, and they got intrigued by this character, Honi,
Yeah.
the circle maker, who I've always thought was fascinating. But when I type them into Amazon, at least it's like 10 books come up about Honi, but they're all by a Christian author, Mark Batterson,
Huh.
who's commercialized, he's popularized the story and commercialized it. It's all about, you can ask God for whatever. You just draw a circle around your favorite car, around that attractive woman, and you'll get it. I'm serious. Like, and he's sold millions of copies. Um, and so I'm wondering. I was just wondering if you were aware of that, and what do Jewish people think about that kind of Christian maybe misappropriation,
Mhm.
popularization, and commercialization of Honi, and then have there been attempts by Jewish people to reclaim him? And where
Mhm.
is his status in the he wasn't considered he seemed to be on the edge. He wasn't considered like
Yeah.
a rabbi. So
Yeah, he was not he was a miracle worker, not a rabbi. Um, Now this is really interesting, and towards someone doing some research on the when I Googled circle drawing, um, what came up first and foremost was its use in the Wiccan tradition.
oh wow.
So the what the Wicca Christianity, at least in some forms, and Honi share is this belief in if you draw a circle, it's like some kind of powerful, sacred space around you or whatever it is that you're defining with that circle that can keep demons out or can force God, as it were, to do your will. So there's this magic element to circle drawing. Um, I was completely unaware that people were doing it. I mean, it doesn't surprise me that Wiccans would do that because it fits in totally with what I know of Wicca.
Yeah.
But to hear someone saying, "Oh, draw it around your car," or
Yeah. Yeah.
it's like, okay. Um, but yeah, the Honi is a marginal figure in Jew. He's like part of Jewish folklore. Um, Even in his own time, if your students or you are familiar with the story, he does get reprimanded by the rabbis of his day for drawing the circle and forcing God to do what he wants. And they kind of throw up their hands and say, well, but what can we do with you? You're like a child of God's family, the child of the household. And so, you know, your father will indulge you by giving you what you want with your little circle,
Mm.
but it's not something that they advocate for people because taken to its extreme, it could lead to a lot of public uh, disenchantment with God.
Yeah.
Like if I drew a circle around the congregation and said, God, I want you to give $1 million to everyone in this circle, and it didn't happen, then they're going to say, this rabbi doesn't know what he's doing. And second of all, we're in a magic circle. How come God didn't do what he's supposed to do?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think for both those reasons, the rabbis of the time kind of tried to shut that down and say, no magic circles.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting, in some of the forum conversations we've had in this class, it's all forum conversations we have. One student brought up um, Pirkei Avot 1:1. The Great Assembly taught make a fence around the Torah. Somebody thought, I wonder if there's a connection there, and it made me also think, Honi was alive during contemporaneous with the destruction of the temple. Was he in creating circles, kind of saying, hey, like, he was having that part of that conversation that was saying, hey, the temple can be anywhere. Like I can create a temple with this circle. I mean, this is how I create sacred space. And people started going down this really interesting rabbit hole around circles and the powerful meaning of circles. And then with that in the back of my mind, I was reading this book that I learned about from you, and he says that Moses did this. According to this book, the problem with this is there's no bibliography and there's no real endnotes. But he quotes Bialik and Raniki, page 92. Every righteous man can, by persistent request, secure the granting of his wishes, as was the case with Moses, who, when he was acquainted with the divine decision to deliver his soul to the angel of death, drew a circle round his feet, and addressing himself to God, delivered the ultimatum, Lord of the universe, I do not move from here until thou revokest thy decision. God was compelled to release Moses from the angel of death, and as we saw above, himself to descend to take away his soul. So, wow. So there's I don't think that's from the Talmud, but there's a story of Moses drawing a circle.
Okay.
And then there's also that story of Jesus in the Gospel of John, where, there's probably a circle around this woman accused of committing adultery. And what does he do? He draws something on the ground. Doesn't say it was a circle, but there's always this mystery around that. But and then he talks about this story he found in 1898. This is Olsvanger, of something happened, I guess, in Washington, where, he says, in a certain place a long drought prevailed. Neither processions nor supplications were of any avail, so that in desperation and having lost all patience, the local authorities gave out the following proclamation. If rain does not fall within a period of 8 days, then no man will be obliged to attend divine worship. If another 8 days should elapse without rain, then the clergy shall be dismissed, and every man shall be permitted to flaunt the commands of God as he listeth. 4 days after, so the story runs, strong rains fell. Isn't that fascinating? He found it in the Annals of the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, 1898. Okay. But I think one reason why that's intriguing to at least Christians is because our faith is completely based on a miracle, right? Without the resurrection, the miracle of the resurrection, Paul says our faith is futile. And so there's that real clear difference in Judaism and Christianity, where Judaism says, no, those miracles are actually dangerous. Whereas we're like, well, no, that's what we're all about. Right. And we feel if somebody performs a miracle, we're inclined to give that person the power and authority over any other institution. And so that's why I think
that's a great insight. That's a big insight.
Yeah, I think that's what makes sense with the Oven of Acne story, because initially I hear that, I'm like, what? Why? the voice of God says Rabbi Eliezer is correct. I mean, that story just blew my mind, because then the rabbis say, it doesn't matter. He can perform all the miracles in the world. Which, yes, maybe that does say God agrees with him, but guess what? We have the Torah. Yeah. So
it's right. It's like Christianity when after the destruction of the temple, our religions they were growing together like this, but at some point the branches crossed so that Christianity kept sacrifice and miracles, and Judaism became much more kind of grounded in almost like a secular humanism, except with God still there. So it's like, yes, the rabbis can overrule miracles. Another difference that I've noticed is that for a lot of Christians, they embrace the idea that you can engage God, hear God. Like, my Christian friends will say, I'm going to pray on this.
Yeah.
I've never heard a Jew do that. We just think and say, what am I going to do? So we don't have that sense of immediacy with God.
Yeah.
in a sense that our God is a God of estrangement,
Mm.
for whatever reason. So if a Jew started saying, God told me to do X or Y, we would say, what's going on with you?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Right. And even if a Jew were to perform miracles or healings, I mean, would that be?
it would, well, it would get a lot of pushback.
Yeah. Right.
There would also be a lot of people that would say, hey, this guy's doing miracles or this woman's doing miracles, so they must have some special connection. But yes, there would be pushback for sure.
Yeah. Like I'm thinking of like Levi Yitzhak of Berdichev, or even like the Baal Shem Tov. Were they really were they really known for miracles? Not really. No,
Yeah.
they were known for um, well, all sorts of other things.
Yeah.
um, yeah, and so that is important for us, and yet I think Judaism offers a helpful um, critique for us because obviously Christians take advantage of that. Televangelists, I mean, people, even just charismatic preachers. It, I think we've learned over the centuries and the decades to be wary when you see someone um, who seems to be creating a personality cult around their particular charisms and gifts. There's a question here from a student, and it has to do with, I think it's going to just speak to how you're engaging with Scripture. But the student says, if God gave humankind free will by providing us with both the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, and the Torah to allow us choice, how and why did God harden Pharaoh's heart and thereby deny Pharaoh free will?
That's a good one.
Yeah.
um, I think well, I think if I remember the scriptures right, that part of God's rationale for hardening Pharaoh's heart was he wanted to show both the Egyptians and the Israelites God's power, God's redemptive power. And so if Moses had gone to Pharaoh the first time and said, I will be, Yehia says, let my people go. And Pharaoh says, okay, that's fine, goodbye. Not much of a story.
That's right. Yeah, good point.
So I think it's a kind of a harsh didactic tool in the Torah.
Yeah.
Whatever that means, that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And it's also, if we look at people in power, they usually do not let go of power easily.
Yeah.
And so what the Torah is saying, Pharaoh's heart was hardened, that's a kind of natural human response when power is being challenged to say, hell no.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that answer. At least part of your answer. God likes drama. God likes a good story. He's
Yeah.
gonna do what he needs to do to make it a good story and add suspense. So the question that I want to kick around with you a little bit is very much inspired by the theme that you saw in so much of the arguing with God tradition, and that is the law court pattern, this putting God on trial, and we see that reach its kind of pinnacle in Elie Wiesel's literature, and I find that so compelling. And then when I look at the foundational text of Christianity, these Gospels, it's about these people putting this person on trial, this person who we believe to be the embodiment of the divine, and we believe that divine person is receiving. I mean, what we talk about is receiving all the sin and suffering of the world. I grew up evangelical, being told, okay, yes, he died for my sins, I deserve eternal punishment, but he took that on at the cross. Okay, there's historical precedent for that. The book of Hebrews talks about that a little bit, but that's not the only way of understanding the cross. It was actually the Jung's answer to Job, which I think you referenced briefly in here, where Job says, or no, not Job, Jung says that in Job we see God wronging humanity. We see God breaking his own Torah. And so at the cross, Carl Jung has this boldness to say, this audacity to say, the cross is actually God apologizing to humanity, saying, hey, I wronged you. Now I'm going to bridge the gap that I created because of my mistakes by letting you wrong me, which was so strange.
Yeah. Wow.
But then that was in the back of my head as I started reading the Psalms in depth in seminary, and how there's this freedom to just be brutally honest with anger and even maybe whatever inner violence there is. And what if we could look at the cross as among many other ways of looking at the cross, as God's way of saying, yes, I'll let you put me on trial. I'll even let you convict me as guilty for all the suffering in the world, including all the suffering that even hasn't even happened yet, like the Holocaust and other things. I'll take it because, yeah, the buck stops with me. And I'll let you bury me and put me in the ground, but I'm going to come back and say, I love you, I forgive you, you don't understand the complexities here, but I want to still be in genuine covenant interaction with you. That's a view of the cross that really I find really compelling, and I find it potentially life-giving and healing. And that's so much so much inspired by what you see in the arguing with God tradition. How do you respond to that? I'm just curious.
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
It's too much to take in and respond in any kind of coherent way right now, but
Yeah.
it's a profound thought.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Because and then with the Eucharist, I think of, I mean, we are in a sense, it's this anamnesis, this like remembrance. So that's where I can sometimes be like, all right, God, I'm bringing all my frustration to you, and you're going to take it, and you respond with love. And I mean, one way I see that in the Jewish tradition is in that Elie Wiesel story of the Jews saying, yeah, God is guilty of everything. That's the verdict. Now what do? Now we pray.
Yeah.
And I know, Nomi Seidman said, well, that's more the Jewish way of saying being Jewish no longer needs to be Jewish. You no longer need to believe in God, right? Like being Jewish is following the mitzvot. But for me, it was like, well, what if that's their way of being like, hey, yeah, you are guilty. I've just lashed out all my frustration at you, but wow, thank you for hearing me out. And where else can I go? Like I need you.
Yeah, it's a covenantal relationship. It's a relationship, and so in a real relationship, you articulate what you're feeling. If you don't, that relationship is going to fail.
Yes, right.
And so, yeah, you tell God how angry you are, and you say you are guilty, and then you say, okay, now we're going to continue our relationship.
Yes, yeah, yeah, and it's like a marriage. And I remember asking. I studied with this Old Testament professor in Pasadena, California, and I was going through a rough time in my early 20s with relationships and whatnot, and I asked the professor why, if there is such injustice in the world, and things are so kind of rotten, it seems like, so often and so ubiquitously, why praise God at all? um, and his answer was, because I'm afraid God is God. Um, which, I mean, in a sense, I mean, I don't know if that's what you would say, but you keep going back to, I will be what I will be, right? God is, let God be.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I remember asking him, like, when is it too far when it comes to pushing God? And he says, well, it's like a marriage. Like, when you've crossed the line in marriage,
Mhm.
your spouse will tell you. And maybe that's similar with God. And that's, I was asking him that because, going so far as to unleash my violence onto God to the point of crucifying him, um, is it's not something I do with my wife, right? That's not something.
Hope not.
Yes, right. There's another student who's also she's a priest and author of books on prayer and spirituality. Suzanne Guthrie. She said, I read Arguing with God, including the personal last chapter, with great pleasure, and I immediately ordered your 2019 book, The Mystery of Suffering and the Meaning of God. I noticed that you've written a paper and co-authored a book, Animals Lawsuit Against Humanity. Might there be a series, Oceans, Trees, Soils, Permafrost Lawsuits, etc.? Okay, here's my question. In light of your work and your own life, will you please comment on how the climate emergency influences your life of prayer? And I believe you're writing a novel that's dealing with
Yes.
this
Yeah.
issue,
What does it deal with my life?
or maybe your spiritual life in general. I don't know.
Yeah. Um, mhm. I don't think it really does. I mean, to me, my life of prayer, my spiritual life really doesn't intersect with my understanding of the climate emergency or anything that I'm doing on the climate emergency, other than the sense that the earth is the Lord's and we're supposed to be good stewards of this wonderful gift that we've been given, and we're screwing up.
Yeah.
So I think really that's the extent of my spirituality with regards to the environmental crisis. Animals lawsuit was specifically a translation and adaptation of a um, Sufi Muslim story
Mm.
written around 900 that was then translated into Hebrew by a rabbi in Provence, I think in the 14th century. And then it's been kicking around in Hebrew until my friend and I got a hold of a cheap printed copy um, from about 1948 in Israel. And then we translated and adapted it um, as the Animals Lawsuit. So it's a one-off. I'm not going to do a series of
Yeah, right, right.
the,
Because
the
you can't
plants
replicate
the
those. Yeah.
plants lawsuit against humanity or anything like
Yeah.
that. But it's a wonderful story. I recommend it. It's a charming and very insightful story.
You have your hands in so many different worlds with the Sufi world. I know you've done a lot of interfaith work,
Mhm.
and then the Chinese Jews. Wow, what isn't that fascinating? Boy, yeah, you seem to be anointed, poised to be such a mover and shaker in multi faith work, multi faith works, which I know you already are. Um, can you say a little bit more about your novel and what inspires that, and how that might be kind of connected with the how that's connected with the climate emergency?
Sure. Actually, it weaves together a bunch of different things. Um, the novel is called the Aboab manuscript, named after a Sephardic family. Um, but it traces uh, so-called secret manuscript uh, from its Muslim origins in Jerusalem just prior to the First Crusade. It's given by a Muslim man to his Jewish friend to escape the Crusaders. The Jewish man goes to Spain, reestablishes himself, and each generation passes along this tale, which has environmental warnings
Hmm.
in it. And that takes them through to the Holocaust, where it's given from the last descendant in this family to a couple who survive and come to North America. And then their granddaughter and a Christian scholar find out about the story, research it, takes them back to the Vatican. They go into the Vatican secret archives, they get the story, publicize it. They have a big international conference where the story is read, and including its environmental warnings. And there's a mystery in that that convinces everyone that this is quite remarkable. And then they are about to take heed and do something, all the different religions and political figures are about ready to do something for the environment, and then they all get blown to smithereens.
Oh gosh.
Because there are people, religious people, who are opposed to people of goodwill working together. They think it's a terrible desecration of their faiths, and so they blow everyone up, except that produces this huge counter reaction around the world, and causes people to rise up and do what's needed.
Wow. Wow.
So what is interesting is that the central part of the story is based on one of my teacher's real life experiences, who was born in the Netherlands, and he and his family escaped the Nazis by going by car all the way through France, and then ending up in Marseille, and then escaping by boat. So I incorporate his journey into the story.
Oh wow.
But along the way, I also have him do a lot of arguing with God.
Oh, okay, good.
So
So you
other than the Chinese Jews, I've thrown in everything. It's wonderful to meet a fellow traveler. There are not too many of
Yeah,
us on this path.
you said that right. Yeah, I appreciate. Yeah, the fellow traveler on the lonely path of arguing with God. Yeah. And thanks for introducing me to some others. And I'll send you. I'll send you.
John.
So the theodicy and spirituality is my dissertation. Yeah, it just came out on paperback. It's got William Morrow's endorsement, which is
Okay.
exciting. There's another book that I thought of a lot in reading your second book, and it's this is my copy, not for resale, but The Cloud of Unknowing.
Oh, okay.
Guild. Are you familiar with that text? It's a 14th century English text written about the same time as Julian of Norwich's showings, and it's written like in verse, so you can read it
Wow.
a couple
Okay.
hours. But a lot more people are enjoying this because it's a lot more accessible. But it's all about apophatic theology, which is what you're talking about. This idea that God is beyond all knowing, um, and it's connected with Thomas Keating and contemplative prayer, which you mentioned.
I'll trade you
Yeah,
two books. This is by a colleague of mine. Can you see that?
I yes, the tragedy test. I can
The
see that.
Tragedy Test
Yeah.
by Richard Agler. He's also a rabbi, older than I am. His daughter was killed by a truck while jogging.
Oh my gosh.
And so that was his rude awakening to things. And he ends up processing his tragedy much the way I did. And when I was reading his book, I said, oh my goodness, different style. His is much more accessible.
Okay.
Um,
Oh, yours is
but
pretty accessible.
interesting that we both ended up in the same place.
Yeah. Wow.
Then there's this book. I don't know if you know him.
Yes, I know him well.
Okay. He came through Seattle and I met him.
Yeah,
And,
he's great. Yeah, he's a process theologian, right?
and he got I'm not sure if excommunicated is the right word, but whatever church he was connected with, they did not like his theology at
Yeah,
all.
and he started his own kind of online school now.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah, and he had a student who wanted to do some work on Rene Girard, and that's how I connected with him. And yeah, he posts these things on Facebook of these amazing hikes that he goes on, and yeah, that just came out recently and
Mhm.
is really popular. As I mentioned in the last email, are you familiar with this first graphic novel?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. I have that. I don't know if I've got it here or downstairs, but yes, I have that. Not the centennial version, but the
Yeah.
much older version.
Yeah. Oh, wow. That's probably might be worth something.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just the fact that the daughter died of leukemia was,
Mhm.
yeah, there's, and I think that, that might be one of the most powerful things. And we can bring our time to a close here now, but maybe one thing that something is stirred within me when I read these stories, and maybe it's, my own Jewish background through my father, but it's also a sense that, oh, these feelings that I've had of frustration and anger, I'm not alone.
Yes.
Other people out there,
Mhm.
and they're articulating something that I felt like I couldn't say,
Mhm.
and they weren't struck down by God. In fact, God in some cases seems to really appreciate it.
Yes. Yes. Thank you for sharing your feelings with me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, right. Yes.
Wait a sec. Back up. Your dad is Jewish?
Yeah, yes, yes.
Oh.
Well, he grew up Jewish
Uh-huh.
in born in the Bronx, grew up in New Rochelle.
Okay.
Um, he had an experience not too unlike yours when he went to Cornell University in Ithaca, and then that put him on a spiritual path. He started studying yoga, like
Mhm.
your wife. Um, Lived in kind of like an ashram in upstate New York for a bit. He then studied with a guru named Sri Chinmoy.
Mhm. I've
You
heard the
familiar?
name.
Yeah. And he wanted to be part of Sri Chinmoy's like inner circle, but Sri Chinmoy said, "No, you're not part of my inner circle. In fact, your guru is someone else. Your guru is Jesus."
Hmm.
And my dad was not thrilled with that. Like, no, I I want a guru who's alive, who I can interact with.
Mhm.
Um, he then got into Christian Science, which is how he met my mom, who was a Christian scientist,
Wow.
working at the Mother Church in Boston. And then it was through well, actually, my mom's brother-in-law, and then somebody who was part of the Messianic Jewish world, the Jews for Jesus world, that actually brought him into Christianity, and he identified as a Messianic Jew. Um, and around the time I was born, and yeah,
Hmm.
so so that's in my blood through his side. His father remained Jewish. He was a flight surgeon in World War II, and then his father they lived in a shtetl in Ukraine called
Mhm.
Yarmolentsy that they escaped before the Holocaust. And my wife just wrote a book that just won an award called Uncovering Jewish Creativity in Book 3 of the Sibling Oracles.
Whoa.
Yes.
That's very
Yeah.
specific.
Yeah. And it's through Brill. She actually discovered her Jewish background right before we met. And she identifies as a secular Jew,
Hmm.
which is interesting. I'm an Episcopal priest. She's a secular Jew. It's not, you know, she's not the traditional priest's wife, but
Okay.
she's an academic, and yeah, she's an award-winning author. I'm really really proud of her.
Wow. Fantastic.
Yeah,
Well, Daniel, it's a pleasure to.
it really is. The pleasure is all mine, seriously. And I hope let's stay in touch. Whatever
Yes.
new books, and if there's something else, I mean, I know you clearly you have a lot of different irons in the fire, a lot of things that are going
just
on.
just three. It's like Chinese Jews arguing with God, animals lawsuit.
Yeah, but also all the interfaith work you do.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
That's a
Oh,
lot.
four balls.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, whenever I go down the arguing with God path, it's exciting to know that I've met somebody who's been down that path much longer than I have. So thank you. And again, whenever if you ever pass through, I mean, no obligation, but you're welcome to. You have a place to stay here.
Okay, thank you.
It's a beautiful place to visit.
And also, if you're ever up this way, we have a guest bedroom, a whole suite downstairs. So,
Oh, that's so sweet. And you're in Seattle.
right.
Yeah, I have a buddy who's there. Well, yeah, I have a buddy, and if I'm up there, it might be fun to just get a drink or something if
That
I
would
don't.
be great.
God bless you, my friend.
You too.
Have a
Wonderful
good night.
talking with you.
Thank you so much.
Have a good evening.
You too.
Bye.
Bye bye.